On June the 2nd, 1985, police were called to a lumber yard in San Francisco to apprehend a shoplifter. When they got there, the suspect, Charles Ng, had fled, but his partner, Leonard Lake, was still at the scene.
Lake and Ng are a dominant and subservient pair of lust killers. One having the lust fantasy, the other going along with the lust fantasy.
Leonard Lake was arrested. Then, in custody, he swallowed a cyanide pill and died before he could answer for his crimes.
Leonard Lake becomes obsessed with having women as his sex slaves, keeping women in an enclave.
Investigators soon discovered that Lake and Ng had a sinister secret. They were, in fact, a serial killing duo with a hidden bunker where they kidnapped, raped, tortured, and murdered men, women, and children.
The horror that they go through when you actually see it on video, to actually see a woman begging for her baby and asking for her baby.
Serial killing partners Leonard Lake and Charles Ng had carved their names in infamy as two of the world's most evil killers. It was a serial killing spree that horrified a nation and terrified the citizens of San Francisco, California. In just 11 months between July 1984 and June 1985, friends, neighbors, and entire families, women, men, and children, vanished without a trace. In that time, 11 innocent people were later proved to have been kidnapped and killed. Many were also tortured and raped by the serial killing pair Leonard Lake and Charles Ng.
Team serial killers make up around a quarter of the serial murder cases in the US. But the difference with Ng and Lake is that this particular serial killing team got away with a lot of murders before they were apprehended.
The MO was this. They would answer an ad in a paper. Usually the ad was for some merchandise that they needed. They would kidnap whoever was selling the merchandise, take the merchandise, use the woman for their sexual pleasure. They would make her a slave, and whoever the man was that was with her would be summarily killed.
When investigators searched the killer's cabin in the northern Californian woods, they found what they thought to be the remains of at least 11 corpses that had been buried in shallow graves. Ed Erdulatz was with the San Francisco Police Department at the time.
I spent 23 years of my career in homicide, worked a lot of murder cases, but this is right at the top of the list of being one of the most difficult to deal with personally.
These two were incredibly cold. They really didn't care. And the way that they treated their victims, they humiliated them, they tortured them. This was what they thought was fun.
The story of the serial killing duo began just over 70 years ago in 1945. The elder of the pair, Leonard Lake, was born in the wake of World War II. Lake had a troubled childhood.
His family have got a history of working in the US Navy. They move around a lot. There's quite a lot of volatility in the family unit, quite a lot of drinking.
Age 6, Lake's parents separated, and he and his siblings were sent to live with their grandparents. There, his grandmother allegedly encouraged some lewd behavior.
He, as a boy, had been encouraged by his grandmother to take naked pictures of his sisters. And I think that this gave him this fixation that meant that he was always, to some extent, wanted to manipulate women.
As a young man, Lake developed his own unhealthy urges.
Leonard Lake identified with a book by John Fowles called The Collector, which was written in 1963. And basically, the story of The Collector was a clerk called Frederick Clegg. He collected butterflies. and for some reason suddenly developed a fixation on a girl called Miranda and decides to abduct Miranda so that she becomes part of his butterfly collection.
Lake becomes obsessed with having women as his sex slaves, keeping women in an enclave that he's going to develop because he's going to survive a nuclear Armageddon.
In 1965, aged 19, Lake joined the US Marine Corps and served 2 tours in the Vietnam War as a radar operator.
I think it tipped him over the edge, the possibility that he would find himself in close combat fighting, and essentially snapped. And that was the genesis of the man that became really a ferocious killer.
In 1971, Lake was diagnosed with schizoid personality disorder and was given a medical discharge. He re-emerged in San Francisco, where he began to explore his dark fantasies.
He married in San Francisco in 1975. His wife finally couldn't stand him because he made amateur porn films. A lot of sadomasochism, a lot of bondage. His wife was very upset by that and effectively threw him out.
In 1977, still in the San Francisco Bay Area, Lake met his second wife. Nicknamed Cricket, she indulged his peculiar habits.
Cricket was an active participant in his, again, amateur porn films and appeared in many of them.
This is the thing about abusive men like Leonard Lake. They're not abusive all of the time. They're able to charm, they're able to manipulate, they're able to spin a good story to people who they want to support them.
15 years younger, Charles Ng seemed an unlikely choice for a friend.
Charles Ng was born in Hong Kong in 1960, the son of a wealthy Chinese businessman, a harsh disciplinarian. One of Ng's releases was to be a kleptomaniac. He stole things. He stole things because it made him feel better about himself. And he did it repeatedly.
Aged 15, Ng was sent to a boarding school in England, but it did not go well.
Charles Ng's family were consistently embarrassed by him. So he was moved around from school to school. He ended up at a boarding school in Yorkshire where he carried on with this behaviour. He did academically well for a while, so he was a child who was quite bright. But he just couldn't help himself in terms of stealing and create all of this chaos. And I think he was quite enjoying that.
In 1978, aged 18, Ng moved to the US on a student visa. He moved to California to study, but he soon got into trouble again. He was involved in a hit and run. In October 1979, aged 18, Charles Ng was arrested and forced to pay for the damages. Then, in a strange twist, a year later, the Hong Kong resident and British citizen lied about his nationality and joined the US Marine Corps. But less than a year after he joined, old habits resurfaced.
In 1982, when by this time Ng was 22, he was arrested for stealing explosives and weaponry.
Ng was sentenced to 14 years in military detention in Hawaii. It was while he was in jail that Ng formed an uncommon friendship with Leonard Lake.
Ng was in military detention and he was reading a magazine, and there was an ad in this magazine Leonard Lake had placed in there, and he responded to this ad. So it was a real chance encounter. And you wonder, had he not have been reading that particular magazine, had he have been in a different place, that these two would never have come together. But they did meet and they wreaked absolute havoc.
Lake's post, advertising weapons he had for sale, appeared to have been the basis of their friendship.
As is so often the case, weapons are a fascination to many people, many of whom have a sense of insecurity. They feel that weapons give them a sense of power. So I think that what really linked the two was a fascination with weapons.
The details are murky, but somehow Ng stayed in touch with Lake, who became a mentor for the young would-be killer.
I think what Ng found in him was a kind of surrogate father, someone who would understand him. He was suggestible enough to fall under the spell of a man of a stronger, older disposition, which Lake certainly was.
Charles Ng managed to escape from military detention in early 1983.
And the one person he deserted to run away to was Lake, who was living at this point in a mobile home in Northern California.
However, the net was closing in. An FBI SWAT team arrived by helicopter, raided the mobile home, and arrested Charles Ng. They made a discovery that would also get Lake arrested: illegal firearms. But Lake was freed on bail and then went into hiding in California. His friend Ng was sent to the US State Penitentiary in Leavenworth, Kansas. After serving 18 months, he was dishonorably discharged and released in 1984. That same year, the two friends reunited. Charles Ng moved into Lake's new remote ranch in the northern Californian wilderness.
It was the combination of the two individuals that made them into the terrible killing machine that they became.
Here, Lake and Ng shared their depraved fantasies, and together they devised a fearsome plan to murder men, women, and even infants on an industrial scale. On the grounds of the 2-acre property, Lake had built a subterranean bunker for his and his partner Ng's murderous purpose.
In Calaveras County, east of San Francisco, where, effectively, Lake set up the dungeon that he'd always wanted for his Operation Miranda, where Ng came to join him.
Based on Lake's obsession with the book The Collector, the pair teamed up to put Leonard Lake's fearsome fantasy, his so-called Miranda plan, into motion.
The Miranda plan was the means by which he was going to be the one who fathered all the new children in the world after the nuclear Armageddon had happened and he was in his enclave with all of his sex slaves.
That's what he was creating with Ng, and that's what he had been fantasizing for 20 years before he met Ng. The project's aim is to capture your ideal woman, enslave her, and have her be your sexual slave until you're done with her, at which time you kill her. In the case of Ng and Lake, the killings involve much more than killings, much more than just sex. They involved torture, they involved the photographing of victims. It was a nightmare that somebody from Hollywood could not dream up for a horror movie.
Ng arrives, and in a sense, they combust the fantasy, because they start saying to each other, what we need is to have lots of children to repopulate the world and make better citizens, a kind of social engineering project through a very odd prism.
Ng was a very shy person who himself could not have done this, but happily joined the venture so that he would have a chance of the kind of sexuality his shyness made impossible.
On July the 25th, 1984, Lake and Ng's perverse Miranda plan was begun. The first woman they were thought to have abducted and enslaved was Deborah Dubbs. The duo would in fact murder her husband Harvey, and their 16-month-old son Sean. Answering an ad for video equipment, Lake and Ng showed up at their apartment in San Francisco. The pair likely killed Harvey and the baby soon after. Lake and Ng then kidnapped 33-year-old Deborah and took her back to their underground bunker.
In the case of the Dubbs family, they took all of their photographic equipment. Mr. Dubbs used to do photography work on the side. They abducted his wife and raped her.
In Wilseyville, in Calaveras County, Lake and Ng kept Deborah prisoner. In what would become their modus operandi, the callous killing team would torture, defile, and humiliate Deborah. They would subsequently subject all their female victims to the same awful acts.
The women are made to disrobe. They're told they will cooperate or they'll be killed.
They construct a one-way mirror so they can watch her. She is literally a specimen, which they can abuse, obviously rape, keep, and even more horrifying, they video it. They video her ordeal, subjecting her to an equally awful, degrading humiliation over a period of weeks.
The pair used a hog-tying technique to restrain their abductees.
Hog tying involves binding the ankles and binding the wrists and neck with somebody face down and their legs bent. So if they try and straighten their legs, it places pressure on the neck. So it is a vicious method of restraining somebody and extremely painful and extremely cruel.
Lake seemed to be the more domineering of the two.
It's clear that Lake is the one that's giving the instructions and telling Charlie what to do. And if Charlie doesn't do something quick enough, Lake kind of takes him to task. But Ing was a very willing participant.
I think Ing, he'd always had these sort of violent fantasies and he wanted to get involved in this kind of thing, and now he's able to, and he's got somebody to follow.
Lake and Ing are a dominant and subservient pair of lust killers. One having the lust fantasy, the other going along with the lust fantasy.
The pair derive great pleasure from the horror they were inflicting on the innocent.
Victims of kidnapping will often try and identify with their kidnappers. They'll try and develop a connection with them. They'll give them information about them. It was never going to work with Lake and Ing because they were emotionally turned off.
After weeks of torture, Lake and Ing shot and murdered Deborah.
Life means nothing. At that moment that the killing takes place, they can barely understand that this is a living person in front of them.
It plays to the deepest fears of every woman, that she is simply being subjugated, humiliated, used. She is simply there as a plaything of these two men. Eventually they tire and kill her.
But their lust for blood was not confined to enslaving, then murdering women for their Miranda plan. Lake and Ing also preyed on single men too. With Lake skipping bail and now in hiding, they would randomly kill men, then steal their money, their driver's licenses, and their identities. One such victim was 34-year-old Randy Jacobson. Unemployed, he had placed an ad to try and sell his van.
Most of the murders were committed in Calaveras, but most of the victims were from San Francisco. They were either kidnapped and taken up to Calaveras, or they were lured up there with a promise of work or some other incentive. And then they would kill them and murder them, and then began to collect their Social Security type benefits.
In October 1984, shortly after Leonard Lake answered his ad, Randy Jacobson vanished. Around the same time, 38-year-old Donald Giletti had answered an ad too. This time it was posted by Charles Ing and offered free sex. The San Francisco DJ responded, and he was later found murdered in his own home. He was shot 3 times. Donald's roommate would later identify Charles Ing as the killer. By the end of 1984, 6 months since the Miranda plan began, Ing and Lake's lust for murder knew no bounds.
Ing and Lake were just the worst possible two to ever get together. I think they fed off each other. I think they both enjoyed what they were doing. And I think their enjoyment by doing it together was actually increased exponentially.
Sometimes they get bored, so they start preying on their neighbours. So obviously these are people with families, with friends, with employers who are going to miss them, who are going to alert the authorities. But I think it's because they feel invincible at this point in time, and they think they're just going to keep getting away with it.
One of the things that they did that is extraordinary is before killing a woman, if the woman had connections, she had a job, she had a husband, they would have the woman in her own hand write a letter saying she was going away, taking a job in another city and wouldn't be coming back. And they sent it to the employer, the friend, the husband, so that they wouldn't know that she was actually missing and dead. This is the kind of careful planning that they did.
In April 1985, Lake and Ing needed another woman to satisfy their deviant desires and fulfill their Miranda plan. This time, the victims would simply be targets of opportunity. Their neighbour, Brenda O'Connor, her partner, Lonnie Bond, and their one-year-old infant son, Lonnie Jr.
Bond and O'Connor and their son are presumably invited to Lake and Ing's cabin, and pretty speedily the two dispatch both father and infant son, kill them, and they make the girlfriend, Brenda O'Connor, a prisoner.
After weeks of torture, they murdered Brenda O'Connor. June the 2nd, 1985, San Francisco, California. For the last 11 months, Leonard Lake and Charles Ing had indulged their depraved fantasies. They included kidnap, rape, torture, and murder. But on this fateful summer's day, the pair walked into a lumber yard to buy supplies for their atrocious activities. When Charles Ing was caught stealing a table vise from the store, it would be the beginning of their end. The police were now involved.
Charles Ing goes on the run. He literally just abandons his partner in crime. It's all about his own self-preservation now.
Ing ran away. Lake stayed and tried to talk his way out of the shoplifting incident. And the South San Francisco police officer went to the car to recover the vise and also found a .22 pistol in the back.
They found that Leonard Lake's firearm was fitted with an illegal silencer. With their suspicions piqued, the police took Leonard Lake into custody.
Lake is now in a pretty fragile state, and I suspect realizes that the whole thing is going to unravel.
As soon as they brought him in and he asked for a piece of paper and a pencil, and you're thinking as an investigator, maybe he's ready to sign a confession. So great, I'll go run and get him a piece of paper and a pencil. And then when you come back, he's dead on the floor.
What investigators did not know yet was that Lake had acted before his awful secret was discovered.
He did not want to go to the electric chair. And so Lake took the precaution of providing for himself cyanide pills in case he was ever captured, which he sewed into his jacket.
It's clear that Leonard Lake knew that he would kill himself when he got caught. He did all these terrible things, and he never wanted to stand up and face the consequences of them, so that he was ready, and he had those cyanide tablets on him in the event he ever got caught.
Lake was dead, but his partner Ing was now on the run. The FBI and Interpol launched a national and international manhunt for Charles Ing. At the same time, they processed the license plate on the brown Honda that Leonard Lake had parked outside the lumber store.
After Leonard Lake kills himself, then they start kind of pulling on the string and everything starts unraveling.
Subsequently found out that the car had had switched license plate, and the car belonged to Paul Cosner. Paul Cosner was a man who lived in the Marina District in San Francisco, last seen alive when he purportedly left the house to show a prospective buyer of his car to take them for a test drive. And he was never seen again.
A forensic examination of the Honda revealed a single bullet hole in the roof at the front of the car. It was surrounded with a blood splatter. Investigators also found a driver's license belonging to yet another San Francisco man who had disappeared.
The missing persons detectives from San Francisco were immediately notified. They went down to South San Francisco, and Inspector Irene Brunn and Tom Eisenman. So at that time, there was still no involvement in homicide.
Inside the brown Honda, investigators also found a utility bill in Lake's ex-wife's name for a place in Calaveras County in Northern California. The detectives questioned her about the electricity bill found in the car. The interview led them to a ranch with a log cabin in the wilderness, 150 miles east of San Francisco. The detectives didn't know what they would find, but they were aware of a number of missing persons cases in the region. One in particular stuck in their mind.
At the time, there were a couple of missing persons cases that were kind of unusual. One was this Dubs family, a family of three, were missing under very strange circumstances.
As they walked through the cabin, they noticed a bed with holes drilled in the posts and on the floor, seemingly for restraints. But that's not all that detectives Irene Brunn and Tom Eisenman found.
Irene Brunn noticed a VCR and some other electronic equipment that she thought resembled equipment that was missing from the Dubs home. And she ran the serial number of a couple of those items, and sure enough, she got a hit. So she knew at that point, not only had she linked Lake and Ing to Paul Cosner in the car, but now she'd linked them into yet another missing person, the Dubs family.
Thought to be the first victims of their Miranda plan, the entire Dubs family had disappeared 11 months earlier, murdered by Lake and Ing. Evidence of wrongdoing was mounting, and then the case took an even darker turn.
Until the missing persons investigators got to the cabin, there was no connection to the Dubs family. So once that link was established, then there were a connection to 4 probably murdered people.
What had begun as a response to a shoplifting incident was now a mass murder investigation, with Leonard Lake and his partner in crime, Charles Ing, the prime suspects.
So at that point, the case was transferred from missing persons to homicide. And my partner, Jeff Brosh, and I ended up heading up a team of probably about 20 investigators from San Francisco.
On June the 5th, 1985, a team of San Francisco and Calaveras County investigators returned to the cabin in the woods. It was just 3 days since Lake had killed himself and Ing had gone on the run.
The police get to the cabin and they begin a series of absolutely horrifying discoveries.
Armed with a warrant, they searched a subterranean bunker or so-called fallout shelter situated next to the cabin.
And it was built into the side of the hill. And when you entered this bunker, there was like a workshop and areas where tools were and so on.
On the walls, 21 photos of young women in various stages of undress. At the back of the workshop area, detectives found a false wall. Behind it, another sobering surprise.
There was like a cell area that had been built into the back of the bunker, in which we later learned that they would keep female captives there for a period of time before killing them.
They discovered the dungeon and the false room, which is hidden, and the two-way mirror and where the women had been kept.
Investigators meticulously searched the 2-acre property used as the pair's killing grounds.
They discovered 2 5-gallon drums which had been buried, one of which contains IDs, paraphernalia, for up to 25 people who might have been missing. And the other one contains Lake's journals for 1983 and 1984 and the videotapes of the victims.
Appallingly, the videos showed in vivid detail the depths of depravity that Lake and Ing indulged in.
You can see how the victims are full of fear and just horrified. And I think they got off on that. That brings it to a whole new level. It was on a horrific level why you would want to tape this stuff. But if you view those tapes, they're quite disturbing.
Brenda O'Connor, she had a little baby. And on the video, she is repeatedly distraught and asking Leonard Lake and Charles Ing, "What have you done with my baby? Where's my baby?" It's very difficult to watch.
But that wasn't all. During the search of the grounds, investigators made a gruesome discovery: human remains.
My partner, Jeff Brosh, pretty much stayed up in Calaveras, and he worked with the detectives up there. And what they were doing at that point was uncovering a lot of evidence that had been buried. We know, of course, that the videos and the gun and the journals had been buried, and they began finding more bodies.
You can see that as their killing went along, in the beginning they're very organised, they're kind of sticking to the rules that they've made up. But towards the end, they are getting quite careless, they are getting quite sloppy, and we are able to identify particular victims from some of that evidence that they left.
Detectives found buried in shallow graves what they thought to be at least 11 bodies, as well as fragments that suggested there was a 12th body. Lake and Ing had disposed of all the evidence they thought might lead back to them.
And what Lake and Ing did is they buried all the contents of their neighbor's cabin in the trench and covered it up. They wanted the authorities to think that Brenda O'Connor, who was the woman with her baby, and her boyfriend and a friend, Scott Stapley, had just left the area and moved on.
The detectives were both identifying the victims whilst at the same time trying to determine the cause of death.
They definitely shot people. They also, in addition to burying a lot of the bodies, they chopped them up and put them in piles and burned them. One of the things that the detectives up in Calaveras were finding a lot of were little small bone chips that had previously been burned. I believe they had a big bonfire. So in some of the cases, it's hard to definitely determine what the exact cause of death was, because the bodies had been so badly burned and chopped up.
In all, the team gathered 45 pounds of charred remains. They belonged to at least 11 victims killed in the 11-month spree, including 6 men, 3 women, and 2 babies. All had been identified.
Ing Lake, one of the most unusual things is that they were said to have fed some of the remains of their victims to chickens, of all things. It actually makes a kind of perverse sense. If you've burnt a body, you're left mainly with bone, it can be ground up, and that's the sort of thing a chicken could eat.
Now that investigators knew about the terrible crimes that Lake and Ing had callously committed, they had to catch the fugitive serial killer, Charles Ing.
Ing leaves and crosses the border into Canada, Calgary, to where his sister lives.
Leonard Lake had committed suicide, but his serial killing partner Charles Ing was still alive, and detectives were now determined to catch him. It would not take long. Over 1,200 miles away, and less than a month after he fled San Francisco, Ing would succumb to his shoplifting urges once again. This time, it would lead to the serial killer's demise. July the 6th, 1985, Calgary, Canada. The net was closing in on Charles Ing.
Based upon information one of his associates had given to the FBI, we felt he probably had gone across the border up into Canada. So his picture was being distributed up there.
Now, Canada, the FBI has international offices in Canada, so when somebody like Ing flees there, the FBI can be on it fairly quickly.
Less than a month after he fled the San Francisco Bay Area, Charles Ing fatefully succumbed to one of his urges.
That strain of kleptomania that had run through his childhood didn't disappear in adulthood. And indeed, it was Ing's kleptomania that in the end saw him caught and brought to justice. And it's almost pathetic. He goes and he steals a can of salmon in a supermarket.
And a couple of store detectives approached him, and he was armed, and he pulled out his gun and shot one of the store clerks.
The security guard manages to hang on to him despite having been shot in the hand, and the police are called. Ing is taken. And then, almost immediately, they realise that they have the man that the American authorities want.
But getting Ing back to the United States to face justice would take years of litigation.
Ng actually committed a crime in Canada, so he has to face justice in Canada like any other criminal would before they're willing to consider sending him to the US.
Charles Ng was sentenced to 4.5 years for attempted murder and shoplifting. He served his time in Canada and he fought tooth and nail to stay in the country.
Ng knew how to make the process work for him, and delaying and delaying. He told one of his cellmates, I think, that all I have to do is fire my lawyers and I get another extension. And so he tried that a few times. So he really was able to sit in that Canadian jail and really work the system.
When you look at Ng's behaviour when he's facing these really serious charges, it's still me, me, me. He's only concerned about himself. He's trying to dodge extradition. He's trying to kind of create a bit of drama around his case. So now that he's incarcerated, he loses quite a lot of control over many things in his life, but he will cling on to those last vestiges of power. So the things that he can exert control over, he's going to.
6 years later, in 1991, Ng was finally sent to California to answer for his crimes and those of his serial killing partner, Leonard Lake.
By now, he's become very adept indeed at the ways of the law, and he starts a series of battles with the Californian state authorities.
And if you look at some of his behaviour at this time, it's incredibly arrogant, it's very narcissistic. He's complaining about the length of the commute to the courthouse. He's moaning about the food. He's complaining about a whole host of things that he feels wronged by, that he feels entitled to. So here's somebody who really can't see beyond the end of their own nose.
In California, Charles Ng continued his fight to stay out of the courts for another 7 painstaking years.
It took a long time. It was to the families. It was a frustrating time.
He's not going to make a very easy time of it for the people who are looking after him in prison, and he's going to be a nightmare for his lawyers and the legal teams that are involved in this.
By the time Charles Ng faced trial in October 1998, Leonard Lake had been dead for 13 years. But he had left a series of diaries written in his own hand and found at the scene of the crime. After they deciphered some coded entries, investigators were certain that Lake had committed several murders on his own.
Many of these crimes were referred to in code. He would code name different planned killings or crimes with names. One was Fish, Operation Fish, and we finally determined that in addition to the women that Lake and Ng had kidnapped and raped, there was a crime, several murders that Leonard Lake had committed before he and Charles Ng hooked up for their 11-month crime spree.
Acting alone, Lake likely murdered his brother in early 1983. Donald Lake had disappeared in April of that year. Lake's best man, Charles Gunner, vanished in 1983 too, but the exact date he was killed is still a mystery. But just 1 month before Ng went on trial, in September 1998, Charles Gunner's body was found buried on the 2-acre property, 15 years after the fact.
We did find, kind of inadvertently found Charles Gunner's body up on the property, and it was when I think it was a phone company or PG&E crew came through doing work that some of their equipment unearthed Charles Gunner's grave.
Long gone, Lake would never face trial for the crimes he had committed, but his serial killing partner Charles Ng would. On October the 26th, 1998, in the Santa Ana, California courthouse, 14 years after his killing spree began, Ng finally faced trial. To secure a conviction, a 36-foot-long truck full of evidence was ferried 400 miles south to the courtroom in Orange County in Southern California. Having found what they assumed to be 12 burnt bodies, Ng was being prosecuted on 12 counts of murder.
The evidence was so overwhelming. When you consider the fact that you had him on film with a number of the victims telling them that he was going to kill them, Along with all of the other evidence that was found, it was a pretty rock-solid case. I went down to Orange County and testified. And in fact, he never made eye contact with me, and I never saw him really make eye contact with anybody else. He just kind of looked down the entire time.
In February 1999, nearly 17 years after the serial killers began their murderous pursuits, Charles Ng was convicted on 11 counts of homicide. The jury found him guilty of murdering 6 men, 3 women, and 2 infant children. They deadlocked on the 12th count. There was simply not enough evidence for the jury to convict him.
He's convicted of killing 11, including 2 infants, 3 women, and 6 men. Ng is sentenced to death, but he's now on death row in St. Quentin.
When, if ever that ever happens, is anybody's guess. But that's where he is. But at least he's locked away. I don't think he'll ever get out.
More than 30 years on, and the memories of the mass murders perpetrated by partners Leonard Lake and Charles Ng still plague the homicide detectives who worked on the case.
After a while, you become somewhat hardened, I guess, but when you're dealing with small children or babies, they're just innocent people taken advantage of and abducted. And then you see the horror that they go through. Then to actually see a woman begging for her baby and asking for her baby, that's very unusual and very difficult to deal with.
When I look at the Lake and Ng case, we've got a meeting of 2 incredibly twisted minds here, and together they created this alternative, depraved reality. But I think the scariest thing is these 2 weren't mad, they weren't crazy, they knew exactly what they were doing, and yet they chose to do it anyway. And the thought of people deciding and choosing to do the things they did really does chill me to the bone.
It's, a really good thing that shoplifting incident happened, because that's what was the domino that fell to start the whole process, or else these guys may still be out there.
The suicide of Leonard Lake and the conviction of Charles Ng finally brought an end to the serial killing spree. But the lessons learned by investigators will hopefully help them catch and convict the next murderous pair before they too join the ranks of the world's most evil killers. September 1995, Anglesey, North West Wales. 56-year-old Henry Roberts had returned home after having drinks at the local pub. When he heard a noise outside his cottage, he went to investigate. Unbeknownst to Henry, it was a deadly trap.
Henry came out to see what the disturbance was, and saw this figure in black. He had black leather trousers on, he had jack boots, a black leather jacket, and a black leather slash-peak cap. The idea was to look like a Nazi officer.
The man in black was 49-year-old local cinema owner Peter Moore, who was armed with a commando knife. Moore launched an attack on Henry and stabbed him repeatedly.
When Peter Moore kills Henry Roberts, he stabs him 27 times. This is way more violence than he actually needs to end his victim's life.
Moore, in the end, pulled his trousers down and stabbed him in both buttocks. The final humiliation, if you like.
I mean, it was so astonishing. On the one hand, you have the respectable businessman. On the other hand, the cold-hearted killer.
He was a sexual predator who terrorized men in the north of Wales for nearly 2 decades and would go on to claim 3 more innocent lives in less than 3 months. That makes Peter Moore one of the world's most evil killers. The 25th of December 1995, North Wales. Most people were enjoying the festive period when news broke that a serial killer had been loose in the sleepy seaside town of Kinmel Bay, and he was one of their own.
I think people were very shocked for a number of reasons. It's the only case of serial killing in North Wales, and the fact that all 4 murders were carried out within a short period. The brutality of the murders as well was quite horrendous.
The man responsible was 49-year-old local cinema owner Peter Moore, who'd killed and mutilated 4 people. He would also admit to nearly 50 attacks on men between 1975 and 1995.
I'd known him 13, 14 years, and I'd been to his home, I'd spent time with him, and realised that I didn't know him at all. And I mean, there was something quite evil there, and I didn't see the monster because the monster was so well hidden.
Even seasoned detective Dave Morris was shocked by the depravity of the crimes.
It's almost 24 years now since I arrested Peter Moore for those murders. Certainly in my police career, we've never had anything like that in North Wales before. He presented this persona to the outside world that he was a nice gentleman that would do anything for anybody, but deep down he had this dark side to him, which eventually took over his whole persona, and that was just one of a very brutal, psychopathic murderer.
This killer's story begins on the 19th of September 1946. Peter Howard Moore was born in St Helens in Lancashire, in the northwest of England. He was the only child of Edith and Ernest Moore.
He was considered somewhat of a miracle baby because his mother thought she couldn't actually conceive, and she had essentially doted on him much of his life. He had a close relationship with her.
She had him when she was well into her 40s. And I think in this way, he does differ quite significantly from a lot of serial killers. Many serial killers, you look at their childhoods, they're full of neglect. But in this case, it seems to be the opposite end of the spectrum. This was somebody who was overindulged, essentially. This was somebody who never faced any consequences for their actions. He could do pretty much whatever he liked.
Peter had a very different relationship with his father.
His father, Ernest Moore, was a disciplinarian, but he certainly didn't make his son's life easy. So he came to loathe his father and adore his mother, Edith.
He made some quite strong comments about his father. He suspected that his father was gay, and there are hints that his father had been violent as well. His father, according to Peter Moore, was an alcoholic, and Peter Moore didn't like alcohol.
In 1952, the family moved to Kinmel Bay, a small seaside town in northeast Wales.
The North Wales coast is historically a tourist area. In the winter, it's reasonably quiet, and Kinmel Bay in particular reverts to a sort of community village type atmosphere.
Moore lived in a comparatively substantial house, and his parents were relatively prosperous. They ran an ironmonger's, a family business.
The family was well respected in the area. They provided a much needed service, and especially amongst the elderly, they didn't have to walk far.
Moore lived a comfortable lifestyle compared to most of the other children in the area.
He was the son of a local shop owner. So I think this would have given him a sense that he was above his peers. He felt superior to them. And this would not have endeared him to the children of this particular part of Wales, many of whom their parents came from working class backgrounds.
At school, Moore was described as being well behaved, but he was a loner, and his height made him stand out from other children.
He was much taller than them. So there's that sense of exclusion from the peer group, but there's also a sense of feeling better than them. And I think his elevated height was something he accorded with elevated status. He felt that he was above them and looked down on them.
He also felt that he was entitled to a lot of things. He was a boy of vanity, and that vanity was to emerge as his life went on and turn itself into a much darker quality.
Isolated and alone, Peter developed a passion for film.
He had a home cine camera, and I think that instilled in him this fascination with cinema, with movies, with storytelling.
After leaving school, Moore went to work with his father at the hardware shop. For the next 29 years, his passion for the cinema was put on hold. Peter was gay, but kept his sexuality hidden from his parents.
It was something that he didn't feel able to share because I think at this time, in a very kind of traditional community, being gay was not okay. It was something that was heavily stigmatised.
Remember, until 1967, you could be arrested, convicted and imprisoned for being homosexual in this country. Moore was very aware of that. So although there may have been a certain number of covert relationships as he was beginning to grow through adolescence and into young manhood, I suspect almost all the time he concealed it as effectively as he possibly could.
After hours, Moore would frequent gay bars in and around Liverpool. He would also travel to London to watch sex shows. It was around this time that he developed an interest in sadomasochism.
One of the fascinations about sadomasochism is that it can arise from comparatively simple things: tying someone up, subjugating them, wanting to be in complete control. And so once that had placed itself in Moore's psyche, I think he took it upon himself always to be dominant, and what's more, always to use his dominance.
Moore also had a fascination with Nazi subculture and memorabilia.
If you accept that Moore wanted to control, there can be no more powerful icon of control than Adolf Hitler and Nazi Germany. The two almost go hand in hand. And there was certainly a tendency in the early 60s for there to be a connection between Nazism and sadomasochism.
His appetite to control men would soon turn violent.
Because of Moore's covert personality, this dominant male, he took great pleasure in homosexual encounters in which he would not only attack a submissive male, he would also demonstrate to other males just how dominant he was. Moore used his homosexuality in that isolated community to become a preying individual. He would prey upon vulnerable homosexuals who didn't know quite how to handle their homosexuality.
I think Peter Moore was well aware of the homophobia that existed in society at that time, and he knew that there was a sense of stigma, that the men that he attacked were unlikely to report those attacks. So I think he felt secure in the knowledge that he was targeting a marginalised group. And the more extreme his offending got, he really did feel invincible at this point in time.
Peter Moore's desire for dominance and control was escalating by the day. Soon his need for control would turn violent, and he began to attack random men in the surrounding areas.
He would go with whichever boyfriend he had at the time, and they would drive around the sort of rural areas looking for older men walking home, generally from the pub. He'd park further up the road, and as they walked past, he'd jump from behind, normally with a rubber cosh, and he'd severely attack them. Some people were left very, very, very badly injured as a consequence of those attacks.
They were really brutal. People were beaten unconscious. So these were really, really serious physical assaults. And they were almost escalating, I'd say, in ferocity as his need to exert control got even greater.
Despite some of the attacks being reported, Peter Moore's name or any of the men he was with at the time never came up in any of the inquiries.
We were investigating those through the 1980s, but obviously we didn't connect Peter as the man that we were looking for. Peter didn't have any criminal record. There was no reason to suspect him in those days.
Moore continued with the facade as the son of a respectable local businessman, but by night he was a violent predator. In 1979, his father Ernest died. Moore had already been running the business, but now he was head of the household too.
He has to be in command, has to look after his mother, has to run the ironmongers, and at the same time wants to make a mark on the local community as a respected figure.
Moore opened up a video rental section in his shop, which reignited his passion for film. Eventually, he would close the hardware shop, and in 1991, he opened his first cinema. In the winter of 1994, he opened a second one in Holyhead, as fellow cinema owner Lewis Colwell recalls.
He gave the impression that cinemas were for families and children, and that's what he believed in. People liked him, people talked to him. He was very approachable.
He became a real pillar of the community in this regard. So he was the one who brought the glitz and the glamour of Hollywood to the rainy, Welsh, sleepy villages.
There can be no doubt that Peter Moore got a great deal of kick out of combining his passion for darkness and his passion for the cinema, and he was absolutely relishing the fact that he had a secret life that he kept hidden from the world.
Life was going well for Moore, but in April 1994, tragedy struck when his beloved mother passed away.
She has been the focus of Moore's life, the focus of trying to keep up appearances. He could never have admitted to his mother any of his secret exploits. Gay relationships, cruising gay areas, but once she was dead, it was quite a different matter. Edith had been the restraint on Peter Moore. Without her, he quickly escalated into what he was probably all along.
With the house to himself, Moore was now free to indulge with his sexual fantasies at home.
While his mother was alive, he kept his interest in sadism and masochism away from the home. After the death of his mother, he brought that side of things into his home life, and there was all sorts of S&M paraphernalia in the rooms. Whippings and floggings had taken place in the property. The death of his mother had been like a release valve for him, if you like. He didn't have to sort of keep a cap on it anymore. That side had overtaken.
In the summer of 1995, Moore opened a third cinema, the Wedgwood in Denbigh, and revelled in the limelight.
The first time I met Peter Moore was when he was about to open the cinema, and he was understandably looking for publicity, and he was always prepared to pose for pictures and always prepared to give a quote.
He was hailed a hero because he came in on a blaze of publicity. The newspapers really, went to town. The saviour of cinemas, he was on the 6 o'clock news.
But beneath the veneer of the successful businessman, Moore was financially unstable.
All the cinemas he had were in little North Wales market towns. They weren't taking any money, they were just ticking over or even running at a loss.
Moore extended himself too quickly. 3 cinemas, all in a shortish space of time. He couldn't allow it to be seen that he was actually struggling. And he certainly couldn't allow it to be seen that he would actually close one of the 3 cinemas. Indeed, quite the opposite. He started to say, I'm going to open a 4th cinema, which of course he never did, because he was simply in financial difficulty.
With the financial pressure mounting, so was Moore's need for control and violence.
Well, what happens in many of these cases is that criminal behavior escalates. He's inflicting pain on others, and then he becomes more and more brutal. And then it escalates to the highest form of sadism, and that is actually killing the victim.
On the 19th of September 1995, Moore decided to buy himself a macabre birthday present to celebrate his 49th birthday.
And he went to a local gun shop in Rhyl, and he bought a very lethal-looking double-bladed commando knife in a sheath. He told me later that he'd been thinking of murdering somebody for some time. The pressure of the bank, the financial situation, everything, he just felt that he wanted to kill somebody.
With murder on his mind, Moore had his eyes set on his first victim, 56-year-old retired railway worker Henry Roberts.
Henry Roberts lived alone in quite a run-down cottage in Anglesey. He was somewhat of a recluse, really. He would go to the local pub, that was his routine. Peter Moore had a cinema in Holyhead and would drive home in Kinmel Bay. As he was driving along the A5 road, he would pass Henry Roberts every evening, and he decided Henry would be a good person to kill.
Moore then set about putting his devious fantasies into action and paid Henry a visit.
Peter Moore pretends to break down in Henry Roberts' driveway, and Henry comes out to see if he needs any assistance, and the two strike up a conversation. It emerges that they're both interested in Nazi memorabilia. So this particular event has given Peter some knowledge about his victim to be able to plan his next move.
A couple of nights later, Moore returned once again to Henry's cottage, but this time he was armed with his knife and was dressed for the occasion.
He had black leather trousers on, he had jack boots, a black leather jacket, and a black leather slash-peak cap. The idea, he said, was to sort of look like a Nazi officer. Peter caused a distraction outside to attract Henry out to the cottage. Henry came out to see what the disturbance was and saw this figure in black.
Moore then launched a brutal attack on the defenceless man.
And he began to stab Henry. So when Henry realised that he was under attack, he turned around and tried to get back to the safety of his cottage. He wasn't very steady on his feet, and as he scurried back to his cottage, Peter walked behind him and stabbed him repeatedly. He collapsed near to one of the outhouses in the yard and died.
When Peter Moore kills Henry Roberts, he stabs him 27 times. This is way more violence than he actually needs to end his victim's life.
In a final act of depravity, Moore decided to humiliate his victim.
After he died, he pulled down his trousers and he stabbed him twice in the buttocks and left him in that position.
So it's not enough just to kill him, he wants to demean him as well. He wants to experience feeling power and control.
Moore left Henry's mutilated body and fled the scene. 4 days later, locals at Henry's pub became concerned when they hadn't seen him.
Finally, one of the regulars went to see what had happened to him and visited his house, only to find Henry Roberts' dead body outside the house. The regular ran back to the pub and told the landlady who was cleaning the windows to call the police.
North Wales police arrived to investigate.
Originally, when Henry Roberts' body was discovered, the police suspected a burglary that had gone wrong. But then, of course, they discovered there was quite a lot of money in the house. At one point, a 21-year-old was arrested, but never charged, of course, because there was no connection to Roberts.
A second man would also be arrested, but later released without charge for the murder. There seemed no obvious motive for the killing, and Peter Moore had seemingly got away with murder, something that gave him a perverse thrill and would only ignite his desire to kill again.
After that first killing, I think Peter Moore would have felt a sense of being back in control. Now that he has externalised that rage, he's taken that out on somebody else, he feels that he has some power back. All those other things that are going on in his life, his mother dying, his financial issues, they don't matter anymore because he's back in control.
Keep in mind, these murders are sexually motivated, and the sexual instinct is very, very strong. And so when someone kills and gets sexually gratified in the way Moore did, they want to do it again.
And that opportunity would come less than a month later, in October that year.
Peter took a night off. He went to Liverpool, drove there in his van, and he went to a club called Paco's, which was a gay bar in Liverpool. I think Edward Carthy was there.
Edward Carthy was 28. His partner had recently killed himself. Edward was obviously deeply upset and took refuge in Paco's. It was there he had the misfortune to encounter Peter Moore.
Moore is smart. He's not going after anybody. He's going after only people he thinks he can get over on. And he's pretty good at detecting who those people are.
Edward, I think he'd had a few to drink, and he approached Peter and started to speak to him. And Edward asked him if he could have a lift home. He said, "Where are you going? I'm going back to North Wales. Can you give me a lift back to Birkenhead?"
Edward gets into Moore's transit van and he falls asleep. Moore decides that he's not going to take Edward back to his flat. Instead, he's going to take him to his old hunting ground in North Wales. Edward wakes up and realises that he's nowhere near Birkenhead, and in fact, he's in rural Wales. I think at that moment, Edward feared for his life. And he tries to jump out of the transit van.
Moore pulled into the forest track and stopped the engine. He then ordered Edward Carthy to get out of the van.
Edward Carthy starts to panic, and according to Peter Moore, he said, "You're not one of those Nilsson types, are you?"
And Moore says, barely flinching, "Yes, I am." And he stabs him 4 times. And he disposes of Edward's body, hides it off the track in the midst of the forest.
Unlike Henry Roberts, Edward wasn't reported missing.
The family didn't notice anything unusual because Edward was quite transient. He would come and he would go.
In a space of a month, Peter Moore has committed 2 murders and got clean away with both of them.
Moore felt invincible, and on the 30th of November, just over a month after killing Edward Carthy, he was about to strike for a 3rd time.
Late in November, Moore is once again on the hunt for another victim. Of all unlikely places, it's on a site of roadworks on the A5, the main road across North Wales and into Anglesey. And as he's driving back to his own house, he happens to see a caravan with its lights on.
The caravan was a temporary home for 49-year-old Keith Randalls, a security manager from Chester.
He'd had a couple of pints in the pub and then bought some chips from the chip shop and taken them back to the caravan, where he'd sort of spent the evening then, watching telly. He'd rung his daughters and just spent the night in the van.
Dressed in black, Moore approached the worksite.
He bangs on the door of the caravan. Keith wasn't expecting anyone to knock at the door on that night. He certainly wasn't expecting a black-clad Peter Moore standing in front of him. He's barely opened the door when Moore launches an attack on him and starts to stab him. Keith fights back. There is a struggle. Moore, in the end, overpowers him brutally, ruthlessly, stabbing him repeatedly. Keith had defensive wounds on his hands where he tried to stop Moore.
And during the attack, Keith Randalls, according to Vincent Moore, asked him why he was doing it, and his reply, chillingly, was for fun.
Despite Keith putting up a fight, he succumbed to his horrific injuries. Moore was unfazed by the vicious attack and calmly left the crime scene. But he'd made a mistake.
As he sort of went back to his house and was getting ready to go to bed, he realised he had a black clip on tie, and it obviously come off during the fight. So he had to drive back to the murder scene to recover his black tie.
With Keith lying dead outside the caravan, Moore decided to violate his victim further.
Just as he'd done with Henry Roberts, pulled down Keith Randall's trousers and he stabbed him in the genitals. Another act of humiliation, to defile the victim, to render them an object, and also to increase Moore's own sexual gratification.
The father of 2 was found by workmen as they arrived for work that morning.
It's a very difficult one to understand, and it must be very difficult for Keith Randall's family to understand why he should be subjected to such a horrific attack just for doing a job and staying where he did.
The police were now aware of 2 dead bodies in just over 2 months. The body of Edward Carthy remained undiscovered in Clocaenog Forest.
Again, there was no obvious motive, there was no direct link, So a murder investigation was launched again. So there was 2 murder investigations running at the same time on Anglesey.
With no one suspecting the triple murderer, cinema owner Moore was free to continue with his deviant desires and soon had his eyes set on his next victim.
Tony Davis worked in the crematorium in Kinmel Bay, a family man. He left home quite late, and I told his wife he was going to visit his aunt and take a meal to her. She had recently had an operation, and so he went to Pensan, which is near Abergele, where she lived. It was about 11 o'clock at night.
At some point in the early hours of the 18th of December, Moore spotted 40-year-old Anthony Davis at Pensan Beach. Armed with his knife, he pounced.
Anthony was a strong man and didn't give up without a fight.
Anthony fought back, and what happened was the knife had been turned on Peter on his arm during the scuffle.
Anthony Davis was stabbed 5 times in the chest and once in the back. He eventually died from his injuries. The heartless killer then tended to his own wounds.
He took Anthony's coat and wrapped it round his injury and left the scene with the coat still round his arm. And when he got home, he washed the coat and he hung it up in his house.
Meanwhile, Anthony's wife grew concerned when her husband didn't return home that evening.
At about 4:30, now the Monday morning, she rings the elderly aunt and says, "Have you seen Anthony?" And the lady says, no, he left at 12:30.
She suspected that her husband had been to Pensan Beach sometime before, and so she asked one of his brothers to go to the beach to have a look.
The brothers set off to look for Anthony. Anthony's wife has not just simply phoned his brothers, but she's also phoned the police. And in one of the most terrible ironies of this dreadful event is that the brothers and the police arrive almost simultaneously at the beach to discover Anthony's mutilated body.
Police found Anthony's car parked in the car park, but it was locked. They then discovered his body on the shore. The police knew they had to act fast to catch their killer. Dave Morris was part of the investigation team.
The senior investigation officer was aware of the reputation that Pensan Beach had as being a meeting place for gay men, so made an appeal to the gay community to try and identify who might be the person responsible for this particular murder in Pensan.
But at the outset, there really wasn't much movement until finally the local North Wales police were persuaded to open an anonymous tip line for gay men.
We had a very good response, and one thing that became quite clear was that there was a male who dressed in black leather jacket and black trousers who had historically attacked men on Pensan Beach and robbed them. He'd taken property belonging to them, watches and the like, and this had been going on for some period of time. Another line of inquiry that we had was a transit van had been seen on Pensan Beach at around the time of the murder, certainly over that nighttime period. So there were 2 focuses to the investigation. One was to try and identify the driver of the van, and the other was to try and identify the unknown man in black.
Dave would finally get a breakthrough from an anonymous caller 48 hours into the investigation.
Somebody had called on the hotline and described being picked up on Pensan Beach and taken to a house in Kinmel Bay where he'd been attacked, and he described himself as being lucky to get away with his life. I followed the loose directions that were given by the caller, and I was able to identify Peter Moore's house. I was aware of Peter Moore from my time as a uniformed police officer. Peter was running the hardware shop, and we quite frequently phoned for police assistance. I was aware that Peter was a gay man, that he liked to wear black leather clothing. So I came back to the incident room in Kinmel Bay and reported that I believed I'd identified the house, and the house was owned by a gentleman called Peter Moore.
The police also had a breakthrough with the van that was spotted at the murder scene.
2 other detectives came in, and they'd established that there was a van hire company in Denbigh who had hired a white transit van to a guy called Peter Moore. And it was at that point, a decision was made to arrest him.
The police had now identified the man in black as Peter Moore. On the 21st of December 1995, they now had a warrant to arrest the 49-year-old.
We went out in the morning. There was a team of 4 detectives, and we went in 2 vehicles. And as we approached the house, I saw the van driving away. So we fell in behind it and we began to follow the vehicle.
Moore was on his way to pick up a colleague, unaware that he was being followed.
He turned into a housing estate in Abergele. He pulled up outside a house and just sat in the van. So I took the decision to get out of the police car and approach the van. I'd opened the door of the transit van. He was quite surprised. I identified myself, took the keys out of the van, undid his safety belt and asked him to come out of the van. We just told him he was under arrest on suspicion of the murder of Tony Davis.
Dave would also make a shocking discovery in the front seats of the van.
There was a hold-all bag, and when that bag was seized and searched, the murder weapon was found in that bag. I was quite surprised by his reaction because I would have expected him to be quite shocked, quite inquisitive, asking why he was arrested. He didn't ask any questions, he just totally accepted the situation and came with me to my police car.
Dave was tasked with interviewing Moore for the murder of Anthony Davis, but had no idea he was responsible for 3 further murders.
And by now, we'd recovered the coat that belonged to Tony Davis, we'd recovered the murder weapon. He still wouldn't agree that he was the murderer, but nonetheless was charged with the murder of Tony Davis.
With the killer now safely in custody, the police made a thorough search of Moore's property.
A VHS video recorder had been stolen from the caravan that Keith Randall's lived in. As luck would have it, we actually had the serial number of the VHS video recorder. And when the search team searched Peter's house, they found this recorder underneath his settee. And when they pulled it out and compared the serial number, it was the actual VHS recorder that had been stolen from the caravan in Llangefni.
The police also found other incriminating items in his house.
There was a swastika flag that he'd taken from Henry's cottage as a memento. Tony's keys were all found in the fish pond in the back garden. So it was property from all scenes at the home address. He'd also kept the newspaper cuttings from the local papers of the investigations, so we'd been following those quite closely as well.
Moore is one of those serial killers who keeps things that belong to his victims, and this isn't particularly unusual because they want to relive those memories of the suffering and the murders that they've carried out. It really is incredibly chilling.
So it's put a whole new complexion on the murder investigation. So once I'd finished my interview with him, and at this stage there was no admissions, one of the sergeants from the incident room stepped forward and said, "You're now under arrest for the murder of Keith Randalls." So that took him by surprise. He hadn't expected that at all.
With the evidence mounting, Moore decided that he wanted to start talking.
It was 2:30 in the morning, phone call. Peter Moore wants another interview. He wants to admit 4 murders to you. Will you come in? During that initial interview, he admitted the murder of Henry Roberts, the murder of Tony Davis on Pensan. He also admitted the murder of Keith Randalls in the caravan in Llangefni, and then told us about the murder of Edward Carthy that at that time we didn't know about. My opinion is that he made the admissions because it was his way of regaining control of the situation.
The police quickly set about locating the body of Edward Carthy.
Basically, he was given an ordnance survey map of the area, which he circled where the body would be. And he initialed the map, and then search team went out.
On the 23rd of December, badly decomposed, the body is where Peter Moore says it would be. He tells the police, and I quote, "It's built up over a long time. I must admit, I've always had a tendency towards violence." He also tells them that he had a 5th victim in mind, his bank manager, who he said hadn't dealt with him fairly.
The police continued to question Moore about the other murders and attacks he'd committed.
He described them as a job well done. The fact that he'd actually murdered 4 innocent men meant nothing to him. During that same interview, as well as the 4 murders that he admitted, he also told us that he'd been attacking lone males at night, mainly in the Conwy Valley, but the whole of rural North Wales and parts of rural Cheshire from the 1970s through to the late 1980s.
Peter Moore was eventually charged for all 4 murders. As he awaited his trial date, he decided to blame the attacks on someone else.
He tells the police that it wasn't him, it was Jason, his friend. He was simply there at the time, but Jason, his gay friend, did it. Jason was named after a character in a movie, not surprisingly, Friday the 13th.
Meanwhile, news broke that a serial killer had been on the loose in the small town of Kinmel Bay, and it shocked the locals.
In one word, horror. That a man who appeared to be a respectable businessman, who'd brought the cinema back to life in North Wales, could have been killing people and attacking people. It was very hard to believe.
You know, you get these people who go around fighting and God knows what, you think they might. But this bloke just wasn't that kind of bloke. He looked harmless. I never felt threatened. I never felt uncomfortable. When they said, my God, Peter Moore's murdered, I think, oh my God, my blood runs cold to think. I've been in the house, on my own with this man.
The trial took place on the 11th of November 1996 at Mould Crown Court in North Wales. The callous killer took the opportunity to revel in the spotlight.
Peter Moore's behaviour at his trial really is evidence of his sadism. Firstly, that he didn't immediately plead guilty, because doing so would have spared his victims' families the trauma of a trial. And also because he had silenced those victims. He was the one in control of the narrative. He was the one who everybody was looking at, and he was enjoying that.
The jury were presented with evidence taken from Moore's house, as well as police footage from the property.
The footage was such a strange, incongruous mixture of stuff. Items such as truncheons, German caps, police helmets, sadomasochistic stuff. And then the camera panned to show fluffy toys on the pillows and chintz curtains, and really odd. It just showed the 2 completely separate worlds that Peter Moore operated in.
The heartless killer continued to manipulate the story.
Peter Moore presented to the jury of 8 men and 4 women that it wasn't him that was really responsible. It was the mysterious Jason. Throughout his time in the witness box, being cross-examined by then Alex Carlisle, QC, that it was all Jason's fault. There was a memorable piece of cross-examination, in fact, when Carlisle said to him, "Is Jason in court?" "No." "Oh, can you see him?" "No." "You invented him, didn't you?" "No."
In denying what he did to the courts, he was reliving the murders. He was listening to the facts again in court. He took pleasure from listening to that.
He was enjoying his notoriety. And outside court, he didn't mind his photograph being taken. He just failed to realise the tragedies that he'd caused and the heartbreak that he'd left for families.
He played to the media. He showed his handcuffs he displayed to them when they had the cameras on him. Keep in mind, Moore's a nobody. So if he could have national attention, of course he's going to play to media and get his little bit of infamy.
The family were there in the public gallery, and they had to sit there and listen for 3 weeks to all of the details of the murder of their loved ones. I thought that was very, very cruel.
It took them 2 hours and 35 minutes to convict Moore of the 4 murders. One of Alex Carlisle's quotes to him, about him, "The man in black, black thoughts and the blackest of deeds." And that was what gave Peter Moore the nickname that he still has of the man in black. He was called, and I quote, "a violent and predatory sadist who was obsessed by the Nazis." And also, as the judge put it, one of the most dangerous men ever to set foot in Wales.
On the 29th of November 1996, Peter Moore was sentenced to a whole life tariff and was eventually sent to HMP Wakefield. He appealed his life sentence to the European courts, but was rejected several times. Even behind bars, he craved attention.
I received numerous letters from prison. Many of them dealt with his proposed appeal. Others dealt with civil actions against North Wales Police and some former friends of his. I think the letters were really a continuation. He liked being the focus of attention.
Peter Moore was a coward who took advantage of a social climate, who took advantage of the vulnerabilities of other people, and he's a very dangerous man, and he's exactly where he belongs.
It'll be many years before Peter Moore's is forgotten, and I think when people drive past in Kinmel Bay, they still point to the house where he used to live.
He still remains one of the most brutal killers in the history of North Wales Police. My hope is that we never have another Peter Moore in North Wales. He was a very, very, very ruthless man, and to kill people as a form of stress relief, I think, says it all.
He was a sadistic predator who terrorized the north of Wales for 2 decades, preying on those who were vulnerable. He brutally murdered and mutilated 4 men in cold blood, for fun, just to satiate his devious sexual desires. Undoubtedly, Peter Moore is one of the world's most evil killers. Christmas Day, Bristol, 2010. A couple walking their dog along a country lane made a startling discovery. It was the body of a 25-year-old woman called Joanna Yates. She'd been missing for 8 days.
When Joanna Yates' body was discovered, it was partially covered in snow, and she is partially undressed.
She is found to have 43 injuries focused on the head and neck. Her ultimate cause of death is manual strangulation.
A nationwide hunt for the missing landscape architect had come to a tragic end, and the prime murder suspect was Joanna's landlord and neighbour, Christopher Jeffries.
When you're confronted with police telling you that you're under arrest on suspicion of murder, the shock is so great that really it's a question of feeling numb.
But the police had arrested the wrong neighbour. The real killer was 32-year-old Dutch national Vincent Tobac.
But he takes one life in a terrible way and then proceeds to try and convince the world that he could not possibly have had anything to do with it. It is an act of gross depravity, in my mind.
Vincent Tabak killed Joanna Yates to satisfy his sexual urges. Despite trying to cover his crimes and frame an innocent man, he was caught. The police proved him to be one of the world's most evil killers. December the 25th, 2010, Clifton, Bristol in the southwest of England. The city should have been celebrating Christmas Day, but the news of a murdered woman stunned the local community and the nation.
It's thought Joanna must have crossed or been taken across the bridge to the point where her body was found. Police are still searching that road, which runs beside a golf course, but no details have been disclosed of how or when she died. The police say they're treating Joanna's death as suspicious, but it is not yet a murder inquiry.
I think one of the most heartbreaking elements of this case is the fact that it turned from a missing persons inquiry into a murder investigation. It was Christmas Day. There was snow on the ground. It was quite an exciting time, and we all wanted a happy ending to this case.
Joanna's killer was 32-year-old Vincent Tobac. a Dutch engineer who had an obsession with hardcore sex and violent pornography.
He was obsessed with sadomasochistic pornography. He would watch at length pornography that was dedicated to the proposition of binding women, torturing women, humiliating women.
After Joanna rejected his advances, Tobac strangled the 25-year-old to death in her own flat and then dumped her body in a country lane 3 miles away from where they both lived. Reporter Claire Hayhurst worked on the case.
The disappearance of Joanna Yates became front-page news very quickly. I think part of that was because people were looking forward to celebrating with their loved ones at Christmas time, and everybody was thinking of this woman who was missing from her family at such an important time of year.
The police, in their attempt to try and find the killer, arrested the wrong man, Joanna's landlord, Christopher Jeffries.
The worst part of the experience was when I started to read the sort of reports in the press, the sort of hideously distorted image of somebody purporting to be me. That was the image which had been projected nationally and indeed to a degree internationally.
Eventually, Tobac was arrested, but the calculated killer continued to deny that he had anything to do with the murder.
His own family, his girlfriend's family were absolutely convinced that he was innocent, so he was able to maintain this facade of normality, this idea that he was this gentle giant, this innocent person. And I think when you can fool those closest to you, you're potentially a very dangerous person.
He's never perpetrated a sexual assault. He's never attacked anyone. He's never raped another woman. He seems to have moved from law-abiding citizen to calculated first-degree premeditated murder all in one step.
This killer's story begins in 1978. Vincent Tobac was born on the 10th of February in Veghel in the south of the Netherlands. He grew up in the town of Uden near Eindhoven and was the youngest of 5 children.
His parents were quite a bit older than the parents of his peers, and he had quite a solitary upbringing. And his relationships with his fellow pupils at school, the kids in the community, they weren't that great, so he was a bit of a loner.
He wasn't desperately gregarious. He kept himself to himself. He didn't play with other children. He was kind of reserved, but he was undoubtedly clever.
Tobac came from a good, caring family. The only thing that we know about him psychologically as a child was he was a bit of a loner, and that is very common for people who have sexual pathology, especially if it's what I will call secretive sexual pathology. So no indications of a traumatic event being the cause of his disturbance.
I think one of the things about Tobac, and emerges through his adolescence, is that he was probably fascinated by pornography from a very early age.
Young Vincent struggled to fit in with his peers, but he was an exceptionally bright child.
The thing is, he was developing quite quickly intellectually. He did incredibly well in school, but those social skills that we all have to develop, he wasn't developing those as quickly as he was developing his aptitude for academic subjects. So there was something that was a little bit odd about him.
Nevertheless, Tobac continued to excel academically, and in 1996, aged 18, he went to study architecture, building and planning at the prestigious Eindhoven University of Technology. It was here that he was exposed to the city's red light district.
Well, when Tobac was at university, he lived in an area opposite the red light district. I think there was a fascination that he had with these women because he hadn't really been exposed to intimate relationships. He was quite socially stunted in terms of his development.
Tobac thrived in higher education and went on to earn his PhD.
No question, a talented young man, if a bit, how can one put it politely, removed from the world.
Even in his late 20s, Tobac continued to struggle with forming relationships, especially with those from the opposite sex.
He certainly found relationships with women very difficult. There is very little evidence that he had any girlfriends. I think he saw women as objects and had done so from quite an early age.
In 2007, while studying for his PhD, Tobac found work at Burrow Happold, an engineering company in Bath, England.
So he's working for a company that specialises in exploring how people move through public spaces, so sports stadiums, schools, places like that. There's a lot of science behind it, so I think it suits Tobac down to the ground.
A year later, in 2008, tragedy struck for Tobac when his father, also an engineer, died. The 30-year-old continued to work for the same company in Bath.
I think Tobac's first real job was a learning experience for him. So he's spending time with people who perhaps haven't had the same experience that he has, being at university for nearly a decade, living a rather kind of solitary life. He's being exposed to new people, new behaviours, and he's looking at how people behave in social situations. And because he's very bright, he's picking up on this. He's realising what's appropriate, what's not appropriate in particular circumstances, and he's starting to mirror the behaviour of other people.
And in November 2008, he even met a woman and they began dating.
The couple met through the Guardian's online dating site. Perhaps predictable in a way, given the fact that Tobac was very reserved when it came to women.
Now, bear in mind that he's 30 at this point, so his development is a little bit behind what would be considered normal and average. And he meets his first girlfriend online, and that for me is actually quite interesting because you don't have that same kind of social pressure that you do in a face-to-face environment.
The relationship flourished, and after just 7 months, the couple decided to move in together. In June 2009, the couple moved to Clifton in Bristol, to an upmarket hilltop suburb, and rented a flat from Christopher Jeffries, a retired English teacher.
Well, one of the garden flats became vacant, and a letting agent told me that they had signed up this couple.
Christopher recalls the first time he met Tobac.
He was physically quite tall and imposing, but in manner comparatively gentle and fairly deferential, quite reserved. He always struck me, and I think other people in the building, as very, very pleasant, very respectful in his manner.
Life for Tobac was going well. He'd secured a reputable job, he was in a stable relationship, and had settled into a new city.
He lived in a delightful part of town. He had a very good job and he was on his way up. He had a good social life. He vacationed.
But the 31-year-old engineer was hiding something sinister. He was leading a double life. Whilst he was away on business trips, Tobac was interested in women, soliciting sex.
There was one trip to Newcastle in the northeast of England, and there were records of him looking up the local sex trade, looking up escorts, looking up sex workers. So this was something that he would indulge in when he was away.
So this is a person who has lived in the world, at least in his fantasy, of sexual domination.
Tobac was also a regular consumer of online hardcore pornography.
A man who took a great interest in escort agencies, in pornographic websites, some of them involving the abduction, torture of women, and indeed some of the others involving the abuse of children.
I think that there is very often that connection made between consuming violent pornography and being a sexual predator and being a violent individual. But I think for Tobac, this didn't cause his violent behaviour. I think when he was consuming this violent pornography, it simply reinforced these existing values and attitudes and beliefs that he had about women.
So what we have is a hidden man. We have the man on the surface who goes to Bristol and gets on the train to Bath and comes home in a steady relationship. And you have the secret Tobac, the Tobac who is hidden beneath the surface, who exists on the web and exists in front of his computers. Here is the Tabak that is about to come out, the genie in the bottle, if you prefer, in the twilight world in which his girlfriend knows nothing about.
On October the 25th, 2010, another young couple rented a garden flat from Christopher Jeffries.
Now, this flat was located in the same house as the flat occupied by Vincent Tobac and his girlfriend.
The new tenants were 25-year-old Joanna Yates, a landscape architect who was originally from Hampshire, and her boyfriend, 27-year-old Greg, also an architect from Sheffield. They both worked at the same firm in Bristol and started dating in 2008.
They were living together for the first time. They were obviously very much in love with each other.
Joanna Yates was a very clever, very ambitious woman, and she was working as a landscape architect, and her work took her to Bristol.
Jo struck me as being a slightly nervous young woman. She was very, very attractive, again, very pleasant to deal with, but a little bit nervous in manner. She was the sort of person, for example, if I had to go and speak to her, would hesitate for a little before deciding whether or not to invite me in.
Although they were neighbours, Tobac and Joanna Yates didn't have any interaction with each other.
Now, I believe that Tabak was fascinated by his next-door neighbour, and increasingly fascinated by her. She represented the figure that he'd seen on the net. He would like to have some kind of sexual relationship with her. She, however, was entirely unaware of his interest in her.
On the 6th of November, Tobac went on another business trip, this time to America. And once again, he was looking at adult escort websites.
So he's playing the role of the committed partner, the devoted boyfriend at home, and then there's this other side to him, the real side to him, that comes out when he's on his own and he doesn't have those controls over his behaviour.
Unable to control his sexual fantasies, Tobac made contact with an escort.
He goes to a motel in San Luis Obispo, about 150 miles north of Los Angeles, and hires a girl and pays her $200. Again, he's ostensibly working, and yet, in that twilight world that he inhabited, he's making contacts with escorts, prostitutes.
I would say that Tobac had an obsession with what sex represented. I think for him, it represented power, it represented control, it represented an opportunity for him to see himself as important, because these women were there to serve him. And I think that's a value that he continued to develop over many years.
After 5 weeks away, Tobac returned to Bristol.
The 11th of December in 2010, Tabak comes back from California, back to his girlfriend. On the surface, nothing has altered one iota, except something has.
Tobac's secret addiction to violent pornography and sex was escalating by the day.
I think that Tabak was essentially a bomb waiting to go off. A bomb fueled by an addiction to pornography. Not fueled by alcohol or drugs, but simply the addictions of pornography, which I've always believed is potentially every bit as dangerous.
Across the hallway, new tenants Joanna Yates and her boyfriend Greg had now settled into their new life in Bristol. They'd made friends and were preparing for the festive period.
During the day of December the 17th, Jo had gone out to lunch with her boyfriend Greg. He was going away to Sheffield for the weekend.
Greg kissed Joanna goodbye and then made his way to the north of England to see his family. Little did they know it would be the last time they would see each other. Joanna was now home alone.
I gather she had told friends that she was a little bit nervous about spending the weekend on her own without Greg, and I think she had been intending to do some cooking or some baking in preparation for Christmas.
Coincidentally, Tabak's girlfriend tells Vincent Tobac that she's going to be going to a works party and it won't finish until the early hours of the following morning.
It was agreed that Tobac would pick his girlfriend up after her party. At approximately 6 p.m. that same evening, his neighbour Joanna left work and made her way to see some friends for some Christmas drinks.
Perfectly innocently, Joanna goes out for a drink with some friends in the Ram pub in Bristol.
She was there for about 2 hours and she then made her way back up to Clifton where she lived.
At around 8:10 p.m, Joanna went into a supermarket but didn't buy anything. Approximately 20 minutes later, she called her friend before heading to 2 other shops where she bought pizza and cider. With her shopping done, Joanna then made her way home.
In one of the most chilling moments in this case, Joanna Yates encounters a priest walking his dog and he conducts a conversation. It was a week before Christmas. It was a very uplifting, cheerful time. People were looking to celebrate and to celebrate the season.
After talking briefly about the weather with the priest, Joanna then headed to her flat.
The last sighting of her is from some CCTV footage from a pub just 600 yards from her home, and it shows her walking home alone.
Joanna made it back to her flat at approximately 8:37. Her neighbour, Vincent Tobac, was also home alone and decided to pay her a visit. But he wasn't there to be neighbourly, as Joanna would soon find out.
I presume she opened the door willingly, and there was her neighbour, though they were not by any means friends.
Now, at some point during this evening, Tobac enters her flat. We're never going to know exactly what happened here, but it's likely that the entry wasn't forced. Joanna probably let him in. He was one of her neighbours. She was a trusting individual.
It was to prove a terrible mistake.
Once inside the flat, Tobac made sexual advances towards the 25-year-old.
And at some point during that interaction, Joanna Yates realises, oh crikey, this is turning nasty.
Joanna rejected the unwanted attention from Tobac, something that only angered him further, and he attacked her.
At about 10 to 9 that evening, a couple attending a party near Joe's flat in Canning Road in Bristol heard a woman scream twice.
Now, those screams almost certainly came from Joanna Yates.
As Joanna tried to fight Tobac off, the 32-year-old placed his hands around her neck and started to strangle the defenseless woman.
Most people know what it feels like to choke on something, to find it difficult to breathe. For that situation to be suddenly inflicted on you out of the blue by another human being would be terrifying, confusing, distressing.
And she ends up with over 40 injuries to her body.
It's a horrifying, horrifying thought that a young woman just back from celebrating the coming of Christmas with her friends should be snuffed out by this loner next door who is hiding another individual, hiding Mr. Hyde in the plain sight of Dr. Jekyll.
And literally, in one fell swoop, he's wiped out the life of this individual who had so much hope and so much promise.
Shortly after killing Joanna, Tobac sent his girlfriend a text message. He then went about covering up the murder in a seemingly calm and calculated fashion.
After Tobac murdered Joanna Yates, he starts to clean up very quickly.
He carries, and this must have taken quite a considerable effort, he carries the body of Joanna Yates out and puts it into the boot of his Renault Megane car.
He sets about constructing an alibi for himself. So he drives to a local Asda supermarket where I think he knows he's going to be seen on CCTV.
Tobac wandered around the supermarket but left without buying anything. CCTV footage then captured him returning to buy crisps, beer and rock salt.
And I think probably he bought those items because he was hungry and because he wanted a drink. Here's somebody who is very self-obsessed, so he's going to do the things that he wants when he wants to do them.
With Joanna's body still in the boot of his car, Tobac casually sent his girlfriend another text message at 10:30 p.m.
And bored is a word that tends to come up quite a lot with Tobac. He's bored quite often. And for me, that's quite interesting because that's one of the key characteristics of psychopathy, that proneness to boredom, that need for stimulation.
By now, he's in Asda with the Megane parked in the car park with the dead body of Joanna Yates in it.
Most people, when they commit murder, are absolutely horrified by what they've done. They are not able to function normally whatsoever. But Vincent Tobac is just something altogether different.
With his shopping complete, the sadistic killer left the supermarket to dispose of Joanna's body.
At some point later that evening, he drives the car about 3 miles to a lane in Fayland. He parks beside a stone wall guarding a quarry. He opens the boot, gets Joanna's body out. He lifts her out and tries to throw her over the wall, but he finds he can't quite manage it. So in the end, he dumps her on the roadside, covers her with leaves and snow.
Tobac then drove 3 miles to his flat.
The way he goes about covering up this murder is so systematic. He's literally going through the problem and the solution process. So he goes away from the supermarket, he dumps her body, covers it with snow, and then just drives home and gets on with the rest of his festive period. He's just got absolutely no regard for her as a human being.
Once home, Tobac turned on his computer.
He began almost immediately doing two things. Watching more pornography, much of it related and similar to what he'd perpetrated that night, and doing legal research.
And he starts looking up sentences for murder versus manslaughter. Which sentence is going to be more severe? What's the difference between the two? So he's very much concerned for himself at this point in time.
He was already beginning to plot out, if he was caught, how he would twist the facts in order to make it a manslaughter. He researched the temperature and rate of body decomposition. In short, he did everything conceivable to plan for an escape because he was aware that getting caught was a real possibility.
Joanna's boyfriend, Greg, unaware of her tragic fate, tried calling her at 10:30 p.m, but there was no response, and he left her a text message asking her if she'd had a good time in the pub. Just after 1:30 a.m, the brazen killer Tobac continued to play the role of the doting boyfriend and went to pick his girlfriend up from her work's Christmas party.
And guess what? They go and collect a takeaway. What she doesn't know and can't know is that he'd taken the life of their next-door neighbour, Joe Yates.
With several unanswered messages and calls, Joanna's anxious boyfriend drove back to Bristol on the evening of the 19th of December, but there was no sign of her in the flat.
But Joanna's keys, purse, mobile phone, they're all there. As are 2 undrunk bottles of cider. Put yourself in his shoes. You walk in expecting to see your girlfriend, and the place is empty. It must have been a most dreadful shock.
Greg called Joanna's parents, but they had no idea where she was. Concerned for her safety, they drove to Bristol that evening. Next, Greg then dialed 999, and at 4:15 a.m, along with a policeman, they knocked on Tabac's door, asking if he'd seen Joanna.
Tobac brushes it off. No idea, haven't seen her. His girlfriend, of course, knows nothing at all because she wasn't there. There is an element to this story that I think is chilling, and that is Tabac's capacity to deceive. Here is a man who knows full well that he has just taken his neighbour's life, but presents to his girlfriend, whom is clearly fond of him, as if butter wouldn't melt in his mouth.
The police found the receipt for the pizza that Joanna had bought less than an hour before she was murdered, but bizarrely the pizza and the packaging were nowhere to be seen. With no leads, a missing persons inquiry was launched nearly 3 days after Joanna had disappeared. Her frantic family had a painful wait ahead of them. The killer was hiding in plain sight, and his behaviour after the murder was peculiar.
In the days after Tobac committed the murder, looking at his internet history is quite interesting. He was continuing to watch violent pornography. He was following developments in the Joanna Yates missing person case. So he wants to stay on top of what's happening, because for Tobac, staying in control is very important to him. He needs to know exactly what's going on.
With no news of their daughter, Joanna's concerned parents appealed for her safe return 4 days after she was missing.
When I got to the first press conference, I remember her family coming in the room as well as her boyfriend Greg, and it immediately struck me just how distraught and upset they were.
Over the next few days, with no sign of Joanna, the police continued to search her flat, and on the 23rd of December they searched the other flats in the building, including Vincent Tobac's, but found nothing.
There were fairly detailed searches of the gardens around the property, all the flats. In the end, sniffer dogs were brought in to see if they could find any traces of anything that might be connected with Joe.
The killer continued with the facade and went to spend time with his girlfriend's parents in Cambridge. On Christmas Eve, the police contacted Tobac again, asking where he was on the night of Joanna's disappearance. He claimed that he was home all evening. With the media pressure mounting, the police had no other leads on Joanna's disappearance.
I remember the parents of Jo Yates, I think her dad, said how she loved Christmas. And I know the feeling at the time across the country, probably across the world, was people were just willing her to come home, to be reunited with her family in time for Christmas.
But sadly, that wasn't to be. At approximately 9 a.m. on Christmas Day, 2 dog walkers found a body nearly 3 miles from Joanna's flat.
Joanna's body is discovered in its shallow grave of leaves and twigs and snow in the lane.
The search to find Joanna's killer became one of the largest police operations in Bristol. Over 100 hours of surveillance footage was examined, and 293 tons of rubbish near Joanna's flat was seized. A national newspaper even offered a reward of £50,000, but there were no leads. The police then turned their attention to the night Joanna disappeared. With no signs of forced entry into Joanna's flat, the police were certain that Joanna knew her killer, and they thought that person had to be her landlord.
I had gone away to spend Christmas with one of my cousins. As I was on my way back to Bristol the following morning, there was a loud knock on the door of my flat with the police saying that they needed to talk to me. It came completely out of the blue. I had no idea that I might be a suspect, but when you're confronted with police at 7 o'clock in the morning telling you that you're under arrest on suspicion of the murder of one of your tenants, the shock is so great that really it's a question of feeling numb. There isn't, I think, any opportunity to feel anything else.
Christopher was arrested 5 days after Joanna's body was found, and the news broke quickly.
People were very, very quick to assume that Christopher Jeffries was guilty. This really was trial by media, and the outcome was decided very, very quickly. And this guy had his reputation absolutely ruined, literally overnight. People had decided that this was what a murderer looked like. And when that has been put out there, when the public have kind of got on board with that, it's very, very difficult to gain your reputation back.
One person watching the news with great interest was Vincent Tobac, who travelled to the Netherlands to spend New Year with his family. Tobac had seemingly got away with murder, but he was about to make a vital mistake.
Well, Vincent Tobac, after Christopher Jeffries was arrested, saw a narrative developing. He saw that Christopher Jeffries had been labelled as a murderer, and he literally could not help himself. He wanted to help this storyline along, so he called the police and he said, well, yeah, actually, I remember now that my landlord was out and about on the evening that Joanna Yates disappeared, and I saw that his car was parked the other way round the next morning, and wasn't that strange?
Keen to hear his version of events, on the 31st of December, a detective flew out to Amsterdam to speak to him. But for Tobac, it didn't quite go to plan.
The detective arrives at the hotel and spends around 6 hours with Tobac, and she becomes very, very suspicious of him because he's very curious about the investigation. He wants to know an awful lot about it, especially when it comes to the forensic tests that have been carried out. And she cottons on to the fact that he's taking this information and he's then using it in particular ways. So he starts to give a slightly different version of his story. He starts to say, well, actually, I didn't just go out once on the evening that Joanna disappeared. I went out twice. I went out to Asda, and then I went out to take pictures of the snow. And she thinks that this is quite bizarre. And he's also starting to say, oh, I may have been inside Joanna Yates's flat at some point, and he never said this before.
She becomes convinced that there is far more to this and to Tobac than meets the eye. And crucially, she asks him if she can take a DNA swab.
This was a very experienced detective. She knew exactly what was going on here, and she got DNA and she got fingerprints from him. And he gave those willingly, but he seemed a little bit concerned, and I think this did seal his fate.
On the 1st of January 2011, Christopher Jeffries was released on bail, and the following day a slightly anxious Tobac returned to Bristol. The police now had his DNA on file, and saliva had been found on Joanna's body. It was only a matter of time before they traced the results back to him. By the 20th of January, the police had now gathered enough evidence to arrest Vincent Tobac for the murder of Joanna Yates.
Vincent Tabac's DNA was found on Joanna Yates's body, and traces of her blood were found in his car. So this is very, very compelling evidence. Now, Tabac's reaction to this when he was arrested was to basically construct himself as the victim and say, these forensic scientists, they're all corrupt. They've been taking bribes. They've set me up here. Christopher Jeffries has been wrongly accused. Now I've been wrongly accused as well.
The calculated killer continued playing the innocent victim, even manipulating those close to him.
He had convinced his girlfriend and his girlfriend's family that he was completely innocent, to the extent that they set up a fund to pay for his defence. Here was this gentle giant, this intellectual, quiet, introspective guy who wouldn't hurt a fly.
With Tobac now in custody, the police searched his flat and seized his 4 computers. What they would find would give them an insight into the mind of the killer and his sadistic sexual fantasies.
They find the pornography, they find the bound women, they find the women being bundled into the boot of the car.
Some of the images that Tobac had on his computer stood out for the police because of their similarity to Joanna Yates and the way in which her body was found.
One in particular of the pornographic sites he visited contained an image of a blonde-haired woman pulling up her top to expose her breasts. Now, chilling though it may sound, Joanna's top had been lifted up and part of her right breast exposed, exactly like the website that Tobac had accessed.
On the 21st of January, Vincent Tobac was charged with the murder of Joanna Yates. He had fooled everyone, even the man he'd tried to frame.
I was absolutely astonished. My first reaction was that probably the police were again grasping at straws, and here was somebody else who would turn out to be entirely innocent, because certainly absolutely nothing in his manner, in his behavior, would lead me to have any inkling of suspicion that he might be capable of that in the slightest.
Tobac was sent to Bristol prison, then Long Lartin in Worcestershire, whilst he was waiting for his trial. By now, his girlfriend had withdrawn her support for him. Realising that he was now on his own, on the 8th of February, 19 days after his arrest, the killer gave a chilling confession to a prison chaplain.
Now, he hasn't suddenly grown a conscience overnight. He's had a couple of weeks inside. He's become aware of the strength of the evidence against him. He realises that he needs to change his version of the story to secure the best possible outcome for himself. So he admits that he's responsible for her death. But he doesn't admit to murder. He says this was manslaughter. And he starts to twist the story. So he says, she was flirting with me. She was coming on to me. Poor me, I'm the victim. And she freaked out when I tried to kiss her, and I just reacted. I couldn't help it.
The original suspect, Christopher Jeffries, was released from police bail on March the 4th and cleared of all charges, just over 2 months after he was originally arrested. 2 months later, on the 5th of May, Vincent Tobac admitted to the manslaughter of Joanna Yates in court, but denied the charge of murder. His trial took place on the 4th of October 2011 at Bristol Crown Court. During the course of his testimony, Tobac gave his version of events from that fateful night.
Vincent Tabak told Bristol Crown Court that he had gone into Jo's flat after spotting her through the window. She'd apparently had her blind up. He said they'd both chatted about the fact that their partners were away and they were bored.
He claims that Joanna came on to him. She'd been leading him on. She'd been encouraging him. She'd been flirting with him. And that he'd gone to kind of follow up on that.
And he said that Jo then made a flirty comment about her cat. And he made a pass at her, he grabbed her and tried to kiss her. And he said it was then that she started to scream loudly. And he asked her to stop and she wouldn't. And he said he then put his hands around her throat and started to strangle her in an attempt to control her. And he said that suddenly, after about 20 seconds, she had gone limp and fallen to the ground. There was a moment in the trial that I think will stay with everybody in that courtroom for a long period of time. Vincent Tabac's defence barrister asked him to act out effectively the period of time in which he'd spent strangling Jo. And I remember us counting together those 20 seconds and it feeling like an awfully long time.
Tabac's defence was that it was manslaughter, not murder. To inflict 43 injuries upon a person takes time, takes effort, it is physically demanding, and the length of time that pressure has to be applied to the neck after a person is unconscious, you have minutes to realise that the person is not responding, but yet Tobac is maintaining that pressure long after it would be necessary just to subdue somebody. To suggest that he wasn't intending for her to end up dead is just entirely implausible.
The notion that he would think a jury would be naive enough to believe that story while the autopsy indicated that she had 43 wounds on her body, most of which around her neck, would tell anyone this was a strangulation.
On the 28th of October, after 4 days of deliberating, the jury found Vincent Tobac guilty of murdering Joanna Yates.
In sentencing him, Mr. Justice Field said, "I think there is a sexual element to this killing. In my view, you are very dangerous. In my opinion, you are thoroughly deceitful, dishonest, and manipulative." And I think those words are very helpful to describe Vincent Tabak.
Tobac was given a life sentence with a minimum of 20 years. Justice was finally served for Joanna and her family. In addition to the charge of murder, in March 2015, Tobac was also charged with possessing over 140 indecent images of children, and 10 months were added to his sentence. He remains in HMP Long Lartin.
Vincent Tobac is somebody who is duplicitous. He is cold and he's calculating and he's incredibly narcissistic. It's about me, myself and I. I think what I can say for sure is that he would definitely have gone on to harm other people. It's all about pursuing his own desires and his own wants. If he had gotten away with this, then there would have been absolutely no impetus on him to change his behaviour, to address those underlying values and attitudes and beliefs. He still would have been misogynistic. He still would have been violent and entitled, and somebody would have been harmed by him.
He had every opportunity in life, and he forsake that and destroyed his life, Yates' life, her boyfriend's life, and the life of his own girlfriend.
He only takes one life, but he takes it in a terrible way, and then proceeds to try and convince the world that he could not possibly have had anything to do with it. It is an act of gross depravity, in my mind.
Tobac killed a bright young woman who had her whole life ahead of her, just because he couldn't control his depraved urges. He deceived those closest to him and let an innocent man take the blame for a murder he didn't commit. Undoubtedly, Vincent Tobac is one of the world's most evil killers.